KNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP Darabagosian. Today, it's Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. Today's guest is Chris Tompkins. Chris is the author of Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. He is also a therapist who specializes in working with gay men who are ready to confront the challenges holding them back, from relationship issues, low self-esteem, and the effects of religious trauma to struggles with self-acceptance and societal pressures. And also a former guest on This Queer Book Saved My Life, the podcast that I host. So Chris, hello. Welcome to The Gailey Show this time.
Hi. Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. So earlier this week, we were reporting about how Trump rescinded protections for LGBTQ youth in foster care and homeless shelters. The Trevor Project and the Movement Advancement Project have new data that says about 266,000 queer youth and their families have fled their home states to more inclusive ones. The Trevor Project was talking about how they dealt with this exponential rise in the number of crisis calls they've been receiving. Apparently 700% after the election, 33% after the inauguration. And the Rainbow Youth Project USA Foundation hotline is reporting similar increases. So I am happy you are here today to talk with us about your book, Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground, to help us think more clearly and more queerly about the prevention of homophobia, transphobia, bullying before they begin. So I guess my very first question, what's your reaction to all of this?
Yeah, thank you. My reaction, it's a lot. It's a lot that's going on, and it's certainly something that I'm talking about with people I work with, people, friends, family members, community members. It's a lot. It really is. I even this morning woke up and my book is published in Spanish and the publisher is in Spain. And I woke up to my publisher sending me an email with a news article from the New York Times about transgender people in the military. And he was just saying, like, I'm really shocked at your country and things seem to be going backwards. And I feel really awful and I'm sending you a big hug. So just to kind of receive that from someone outside of the country, just for me was a lot to take in, because it kind of speaks to the gravity of the situation and kind of what everyone's maybe moving through.
The FCC doesn't allow me to use the language that I want to use to describe the moment. It is shocking how quickly 10, 11, 12 days that we can literally throw this country back 50, 60, 70 years. It's okay, but let's start with your book. Tell us how this book came to be.
Yeah, thank you. The book came to be really from my own experience. I live in Los Angeles and I was in Arizona visiting my family, and I've been really in LGBTQ advocacy for a very long time. And I was in Arizona giving a workshop at the Arizona Equality and Justice Conference. And after that conference, I went home to my hometown, Tucson, Arizona. And there were a lot of family members over. I have a lot of kiddos in my family, nieces and nephews, cousins have kids. And my nephew, who was 6 years old at the time, asked me in front of everyone, I kind of joke, his version of whispering was talking out loud. And so he ran over to me and whispered, "Uncle Chris, is she your girlfriend?" And it was my childhood best friend sitting next to me. And his question just really kind of it caught me off guard. And then also just, I started to notice everyone's reactions to his question and how people seemed to be uncomfortable. Myself, I also felt uncomfortable. And I was like, why am I feeling uncomfortable? And so later that night, I started to think about it. And I was curious about my sister and whether or not she talked to her kids. I live outside of the state. And so I've never brought a partner home. I was single at the time. And so I just was thinking about the conversations that they've maybe started to have or not have, which that was kind of a red flag for me. So I started to ask around the next day, propelled me on this path of talking to parents, people I know who had kids, friends of mine, people in my family. And most of the parents I spoke to said that they had thought about it, but or some of the received were, oh, they're too young to understand.
Mhm.
And that kind of opened a door for me of learning more about the biases that we have. So my family wouldn't have considered themselves, quote, homophobic. We had certainly done a lot of work as a family. I come from a religious background, so there was a lot of unlearning. But my family at the time would have considered themselves very open and accepting. And so that question opened a door into the more nuances of the conversation. And so the importance of having proactive conversations with children to help encourage understanding of differences and how differences play out in all of our lives, whether it's sexuality, gender, race, socioeconomic ability, etc.
Unpack for me the too young to understand
Mm-hmm.
quote and perspective, because we see this all the time
Mm-hmm.
with courses that teachers want to have, right, in schools, or gay straight alliances,
Mm-hmm.
or all the way down to the libraries with all types of books, right,
Mm-hmm.
where they
Mm-hmm.
are either banned or put on restriction because of this idea of they're too young to understand. What
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
Yes. Yeah. It's such a good question. And I often, when I'm having conversations like this, when we use terms like homophobia, transphobia, that sometimes doesn't completely or accurately describe what's going on. I'm a mental health professional, and so I use what's called, if your listeners are familiar with what's called the DSM, it's the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose mental health conditions. And so something like depression, anxiety, diagnosed with the condition, you have to meet full criteria. And there are criteria. So when I'm meeting with a client, I'm asking them questions to kind of assess their level of depression. And if they meet full criteria, then I would diagnose them with depression. Phobia is a diagnosable mental health condition, and you have to meet criteria to be diagnosed with a phobia. And phobias exist, absolutely exist, and people have like responses to certain phobias, such as flying or. So when I'm talking to my family, as an example, about like they're too young to understand, that doesn't quite describe homophobia, because they're not. It's not that my mom, as an example, was scared of me, or even my sister was scared of me, or but what it did describe was peeling away the layers, going back, is that there are misguided beliefs. I use the term misguided beliefs, and we have them about everything. Associations. It's kind of, when I'm working with clients, I'm kind of peeling away the layers of the core beliefs that they have about money, about relationships, about themselves, about sexuality. And so oftentimes when I hear that they're too young to understand, it's that people, in my experience, are automatically associating the conversation with sex. So there's a big connection between being gay and sex, like a sex act. And sexuality is more than that. And I, as a gay, when I'm younger, all children go through identity formation. It's an identity development formation. All children go through that. And identity formation is sexuality. And sexuality is more than sex. Movies, and we live in a heteronormative culture, and so I can't tell you how many times I've seen movies where it's such an innocent thing to see a little boy and a little girl have a crush, and it's just normalized, and that's not at all considered too young to understand. And so when it comes to, when I hear parents say they're too young to understand, I'm hearing that there's something bad or shameful or wrong that they're associating with the conversation, or with sexuality or gender as it relates to being LGBTQ. And so I think that in order for us to learn something, there's a process of unlearning. And so really that's kind of the message my book is to unlearn the messages from the playground, the subconscious beliefs, the misguided beliefs that we have about people who are LGBTQ.
You bring up an interesting point there about, kids having, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend in like, kindergarten? And I was just thinking like, I got engaged in first grade.
Yeah.
And nobody thought any, I ran around and be like, I'm engaged. And nobody said anything about it. Nobody was, like freaked out about it. Something that I feel is that the too young to understand somehow is I'm uncomfortable as the adult talking about it. We'll talk about it later, but then later never seems to come. Is that accurate though?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a part of it. I think that regardless of sexuality or sexual orientation, it's just conversation. And, we live in a country that was founded on Puritan Christian values, and those they exist to this day in the laws in states that we don't even really know about. I mean, I grew up in Arizona, and it wasn't until a few years ago there was a law that existed that schools couldn't teach or include LGBTQ in the human sexuality class connected to HIV. And it was affirming a certain identity. And so there were laws that existed. There were also laws, and I'm from, again, Arizona, there were laws that existed. I was in a fraternity in college. And so for a group of women to live together was considered a brothel. So little subtle things like, so for sororities and fraternities, but that law existed, but people, there were sororities that existed on campus. And so I share that because those are kind of in the background of our minds, regardless of what our religion is, regardless of, there's a dominant societal culture that we grow up in, and we take in these messages from
I want to build on that. Okay. I have to fit in a short break here.
Sure.
Don't forget to follow us on Blue Sky for ticket giveaways and more progressive news and analysis. We're at thegayleyshow.org on Blue Sky. Please support our sponsors. More with Chris Tompkins. When we come back, you're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950, KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm JP Dervagosian. It's Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly. My guest is author and therapist Chris Tompkins. His book is Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. Chris, do you want to pick up what you were just talking about right before the break there? Because I think that was a really important point that you were making.
Yeah. So I was saying about, the environment, the context. It's important to look at the context of the culture in which we, and that influences everything from our conscious mind. So consciously, you and I agreed to this time. We're here today to talk. And then unconsciously, they're all of our beliefs and ideas and things that we learn growing up. Some of them we take on without ever questioning. And as it relates to people who are LGBTQ, specifically, there's this association with sex and sexuality. And so when it comes to children, and the thing of it is that, I work with so many clients. It's interesting because it's a unique experience. My book, I joke that I wrote myself into graduate school as I became a therapist after my book came out. And it's a unique experience working as an LGBTQ affirming therapist because so many of my clients, I'm helping them to heal or deconstruct or unlearn a lot of the messages that they how many I work with mostly adult gay men, and regardless of age, whether it's 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, upwards of, I have some clients who are in their 60s and 70s, and there's a common denominator of the messages that they learned growing up about their identity. A lot of clients, I remember, I knew that I was gay when I was 6. And when my book came out and I was doing a lot of interviews, people would ask me, well, how did you know? And I often invite people to consider that, my book really is about centering children's experiences. And my 6-year-old mind didn't necessarily know what being gay meant. There was an understanding, though, that going back to what I was talking about before about identity development formation, is that I was developing. I was learning about myself. I was having curiosity. I have nieces and nephews. My niece, I could tell that she had crushes based on just, her interest in certain things. And, and it was a heteronormative crush. And so it was completely, it was cute. It was well received. It was, oh, so-and-so has a crush. Whereas when it comes to a little boy and another little boy, it's kind of considered, not in all families, but in a lot of spaces, it's considered to be, that's where it kind of goes back to they're too young to understand. I have a client who recently shared with me that when he was 6, he also knew that he was gay. And he said when he was growing up, there was no space, there was no room for him to be gay. And that he, when he said that wasn't a literal, there was no space. It was an emotion. Children are sponges. They're absorbing everything. They're constantly looking to their caregivers or adults around them for any sort of semblance that they're normal, or they are, because children at a young age, they want to belong. They want to be a part of the group. And so they're constantly assessing for, do I belong? Am I okay? Is who I am okay? And so for my said there was no space for him to be gay. There was an aspect of himself that he learned that wasn't acceptable, that he had to push down and hide.
That raises a question for me. You're talking about identity development as early as 6 years old. There's also this thought that, okay, well, if I can not read the book the queer book for my kid, or stop them from watching something on TV, then I have successfully controlled the environment, and this child is not going to learn anything about this or know anything about this until they're 16 years old, ideally 18. That to me, though, sounds like, no, that's not actually what happens.
No, at all. No. I mean, children it's kind of like with drugs or alcohol. I remember when I studied abroad when I was in college, and I went to Italy, and I remember I was still under 21. And I remember all the students I was with were like binge drinking, because back home they couldn't drink before they were 21. Whereas the Italian students, they literally at the cafeteria for lunch, they had a choice of wine. So in class, like you go to class in the morning, you go to class, then you have lunch, you could have a glass of wine at lunch and then go back to class. And the Italian students weren't binge drinking because it was like, it was sort of normalized for them. And whereas the American students, we were binge drinking, all over the place, because it was this thing that we couldn't have. I think that's kind of a sort of, to apply that same kind of concept, is that children, especially nowadays with social media, I write about statistics in the book. Children are exposed to pornography at a very young age, and especially with social media and the way that things are. And so if parents, regardless of sexuality, caregivers aren't having proactive conversations, then children are learning that it's this thing that is secret. And so if it's secret, I'm going to either explore it more, or I'm going to think that it's bad or wrong. And I think a lot of parents and caregivers, in my own experience as adults, just because you're a parent doesn't mean that you haven't explored your own feelings about sexuality and sex. And so there's that kind of, to your point before, what you mentioned is that some parents or caregivers are uncomfortable approaching the conversation with their kids because they haven't yet addressed that fully themselves.
So if I'm a parent who considers themselves an ally, and I have a child in the elementary school age, and I know what you just said, that there are all these things in the world that are sexualized, pornography, probably more so heterosexual than there is queer. I don't like that. So I'm going to do what I can to say, well, no, we're not going to talk about this because you're too young to talk about this. That is not helpful.
No, I think this isn't a one size fits all conversation, and it's not a one-time conversation. I think that when we have conversations around topics that apply to a person's identity, it's important to be able to introduce them. I have a cousin who, my family, just to kind of give a little glimpse into my own family, is that my mom was raised Catholic, very Catholic. And so there were a lot of rigid kind of beliefs around gender norms and sexual attitudes. And my uncle, because of the sort of oppressed view that they received growing up, some of my aunt and uncles have kind of skewed on side of very conservative. Some have skewed on the other side, where my uncle, as an example, was really mindful about talking to his children very openly about conversations. And so he would use terms like penis or vagina instead of like pee-pee or wee-wee, and very normal, like normalizing the conversation. And I will say, out of all my cousins, my uncles, he has 2 boys and 1 girl. And I will say that they have, my cousin, she has such a healthy attitude about sex and sexuality.
We are going to take another break here. We're talking with Chris Tompkins, author of Raising LGBTQ Allies. Remember to visit our sponsors and advertisers and tell them you heard about them on The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF. You're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. If you're just joining us, this is The Gailey Show. I'm your host, JP Darabagosian. Today is Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly. Our guest is Chris Tompkins, author of Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. So we were just getting into, Chris, before the break, about what parents can do. And you were talking about your uncle who was doing more productive conversations, having rather more productive conversations with his children, and that reflected well for them. Tell us some more about things that parents can do that you cover in your book to raise LGBTQ allies, but also to lay the groundwork for potential kids who may also come out in the near to mid future.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. What I was sort of wanting to encourage people to consider is that what I saw with my uncle, and I think what's really helpful, is when we can normalize something and when we can take proactive action instead of reactive. And when we are proactively doing something, we're sort of creating space for conversations, or for children. I mentioned earlier about the identity development formation that all children are going through. And so for an LGBTQ child or someone who's kind of questioning themselves, there are what are considered barriers to development. And those barriers to development can get in the way of a child's kind of healthy, natural identity development formation. And so when we can normalize and help proactively introduce or even allow kids to understand that certain topics or conversations are okay, then they'll feel that much more comfortable with the questions or identity development that they're experiencing, instead of viewing parts of themselves as bad, wrong, or shameful. Because if they're bad, wrong, or shameful, especially for children at a young age, they want to belong. I was mentioning earlier about, we want to belong and be a part of the group. And so anything that I view about myself that I consider to be bad or wrong, that's going to keep me from being a part of, I'm going to hide. And over time, the closet can be a space that provides safety. I do believe that I consider it a hotbed for shame, because over time, it takes a toll on an individual's psyche. And so we grow up as adults with aspects of ourselves. So for instance, myself, even though I came out of the closet and I was immersed myself in LGBTQ advocacy, I still had parts of myself that I considered to be bad or shameful that were sort of in the shadow.
So how do we, when you're talking to a parent who considers themselves, I'm an ally, I'm all there for the LGBTQ community, I just think that I'm uncomfortable because I don't know what I'm going to say. And what if they ask questions? that I don't know how to handle.
Right.
So because of that barrier, they're not even going to. They're like, yeah, that's a great book, Chris. You sound amazing. I want to support you. I'll come to your talks. But I have this barrier of I don't know what I'm going to say. I might say something wrong, or I'm just uncomfortable talking to them about it now when they're 6 years old or they're 10 years old. And so they're not even getting to the point of buying your book.
Right.
What are you saying to that parent?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because at the end of the day, take away the topic, and this is an opportunity for parents and caregivers to have conversations with children and to have an opportunity to be vulnerable. And we're not going to get it right all the time. I often say in my book is, don't focus on keeping up, stay focused on keeping open. And what that means is, to me, is that, this isn't a one size fits all conversation, and we're going to get it wrong. I'm an uncle. I've gotten it wrong. I'm a gay man. I get it wrong sometimes. And, oftentimes, even in like a therapeutic context, there's this kind of saying for therapists and the work that they do with clients is it's not about the rupture, it's about the repair. And in the repair, there's an opportunity and connection. And so I think of that as to children is I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to say something, not even about sexuality or gender, but I may do something or say something that kind of misses the mark. And it's about being able to create a dialogue with a young person about topics that don't feel comfortable. And I believe that the greatest way that we can teach someone is to embody the very thing that we hope to see for their lives. And as it relates to adults, that means that we get to do our own work. We get to explore the things that we're uncomfortable with so that we can embody that to help the kids, the children, the young people to be able to understand, like, this is a safe space for me to have questions. And kids aren't going to always want to answer questions, but that's okay. That's so okay. Is because I think that regardless of whether we have children in our families who are LGBTQ, they're going to have friends who are. They're going to know people who are. That's how I viewed it in my own case with my own family, is that I may not have cousins who, or my nieces and nephews may not be LGBTQ themselves, but they're going to have friends who are. I remember, I could share this really quick, is that I remember when my niece and nephew, my brother has 2 kids, and when they were like 9 and 7, I asked them if they knew anyone at school who was LGBTQ. And they said, no, there aren't any kids at our school who are LGBT. And I said, oh, really? Like, out of the whole school, you don't think there's anyone who's LGBTQ? Do you think that maybe they just don't feel safe to share who they are? And they're like, yeah, probably, because they probably would get picked on. And I said, oh, okay, well, maybe you could be someone that could be a safe person. And so maybe your actions and the way that you are kind of could signal to them that you're a safe person. And so that's what we can do when we can create allies, is we get to help others understand that who they are and how they are in the world can signal to someone else that they're safe.
I want to kind of extend this to because you mentioned the playground.
Yeah.
In your book. And I kind of want to take a minute to talk about educators.
Yeah.
And something that we see with, obviously, I run a book podcast and I talk a lot about with authors. And so libraries are really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Something that you were saying earlier, that
mm-hmm.
people automatically associate sex
mm-hmm.
and adult themes
mm-hmm.
to queerness,
mm-hmm.
any level.
Yeah.
What if a student, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, finds an LGBTQ picture book and it has, a depiction of a pride parade, and
mm-hmm.
maybe there's, a couple guys that are in a leather harness.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's somebody who is, there's somebody who's nude, but it's, made for humor. It's not actually done for like pornography.
Mm-hmm.
What, if the student's picking up that book and their identity development is happening, is that
mm-hmm.
the right? I mean, are we saying that that's a good time because they're having questions about it? They're talking about it, like, hey, I want to read this particular book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I often think that, and this is a really big conversation, because I do think that the pride movement And the sort of where that was born from came from a place of a lot of people wanting to, who were in the closet and who had a lot of shame. And there was this kind of movement around like the 70s of like sexual freedom and really like being who we are out and open. And so that kind of consciousness has merged with where we are today, or at least where we've been the past few years, of books like myself, of people wanting to help normalize something for children. So you have both of those that are kind of merging. So I do understand where a lot of parents can feel like there are certain things that aren't appropriate for children. I do think and infused with that association that we have around people who are LGBTQ, that it's automatically sex or sex act. So to answer your question, I do think, and I often encourage adults to consider, is that the questions that children are asking are indications of what they're learning. And they're also indicators of what they're curious about. And so, since my nephew at 6, when he asked me development, his identity formation, was curious about relationships, couples. Maybe he has a crush. Maybe he was looking for, his own understanding of how to locate himself and his feelings. And so when it comes to children's questions, they're indicators of what they're learning. And so if a child picks up a book and they have questions or they're seeing something, I think that if we can help normalize something at an age appropriate way, then that helps take away the stigma associated with it.
Can you unpack for me that age appropriate? Because I think we all agree that things should be age appropriate, but somehow, like we were talking about earlier, anything by a queer author or a queer person, whether it's, a GSA or books or, courses or shows on TV, films, etc., that age is different for our heterosexual, counterparts. So unpack for me, like, advice for folks, generally speaking. What does age appropriate mean?
It means that, for me, it's the level of the understanding for a child. So for instance, if my niece is, as an example, 11 years old, our text messages when I'm texting with her, the communication's different than when I text my niece who's 16 or 17. And that's age, meaning like that's age appropriate. So I wouldn't use maybe the same, what I would say to my 11-year-old niece. I wouldn't send that same message to my 17-year-old niece, because there's a level of like cognitive vocabulary understanding. So for me, that's age appropriate. So whatever the topic is, it sort of can match that child's age group of understanding a particular topic.
I like the idea that you were saying about normalization.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's what you're getting at there, about the age appropriate conversations about normalizing the realities.
Yeah.
There are queer people
queer people. They exist. I mean, that's the thing, is like these are aspects of people's identities. And that's, identity matters. Identity is important. And I think we really have to unpack, in my book, a lot about my experience of teaching social emotional learning to young people for 6 years. And whether I was talking about the whole program, the social emotional learning was about empowerment and helping children, young people, identify negative thinking that can get in the way, kind of that inner critic that we all have, and build self-esteem within a young person. And so what that did is basically I was exploring belief systems with kiddos, with young people, of understanding like, well, where did you learn about money? What did you hear about money? And whether it was money, whether it was success, whether it was gender. I remember I taught a class for a group of, it was like an after school program, and there were a lot of females, like girls in the class, and they were all part of, there was a girls basketball league that they were all part of. And at the end of every class, we would give the students an opportunity they would create a PSA where they get to create the script and do like a PSA about something that's really important to them. And that class wanted to do one on gender because they noticed that for their basketball games, their dads didn't go to a lot of their basketball games.
Oh.
And because their gender being on the girls' basketball team, it wasn't sort of considered like a sport or something as, whereas if their brothers played a sport, the dads would go to the brothers' games. Mm-hmm. And so these girls were really empowered to talk about gender. So that class really focused on gender norms and gender socialization and, the beliefs about what girls are supposed to do and what boys are supposed to do. So whether we're talking about that kind of subject or money, we all have beliefs around money, and the same can be said for sexuality and sexual orientation. And so if we can normalize something at a young age, it takes away the stigma.
This is why I wanted to talk to you, Chris. All of this. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show. Chris's website is aroadtriptolove.com. Connect with him there to buy his book, learn more about his therapy practice and upcoming events, and also to connect with him on social media. Stay tuned, everyone. After the break, I'll continue my Queer in the Cosmos essay series. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF. Don't forget to support our sponsors and thank them for supporting progressive radio. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. This is JP Derapagosian. At the end of every Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, I read an essay that from a project I'm calling Queer in the Cosmos, which is my attempt to understand my place in this country, on this planet, who I am, and looking at that through the lens of the cosmos. And so last week we were talking about a fun little element called hydrogen. This is part of essay number 2, also known as Light Year 2. We didn't finish quite that essay, so I want to finish that essay and then we can start up with Light Year number 3 next week. But I was talking about how all that hydrogen is just floating around after the Big Bang, created in the Big Bang, and started to coalesce more and more of it, compacting and compacting, until it became so heavy that the gravity of it pulled in more and more hydrogen and space dust, and that pressure set off nuclear fusion and exploded into a star. And that star burned for billions of years. And in the process, the larger stars ultimately created iron and calcium and other heavy elements. When that star exploded and then shot all those elements throughout space. And that hydrogen from the Big Bang might have ended up getting sucked into another star and repeating the process. And fast forward a few billion years, and that hydrogen finds itself on Earth, and we end up ingesting it as water. Or a plant drinks up that water, and then we eat that plant, and our bodies take that glucose and break it down into carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Oh, and then because humans have a special type of psychotherapy, we made hydrogen bombs with it because, why not? Right now, thinking about hydrogen, I feel very disconnected from America. I feel like I did growing up. This country doesn't want me here. I also feel disconnected from a lot of people supposedly on my side of the political spectrum who parrot MAGA lies about how terrible Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were without using that same yardstick of measurement with Trump and Vance. All the reasons why they couldn't, her apparently didn't apply to him. It feels a little simple, maybe, to try and find solace in the most simple element in the cosmos, hydrogen. I worry it feels escapist. But as I plot out my queer body in the cosmos, it does open up something in me. I admit, at first, it's hard to get your brain to wrap around 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang. 100 years, fine. 1,000 years, okay. The dinosaurs walking around the Earth 160 million years ago, well, now you were starting to stretch my brain. Fun fact about the dinosaurs: our solar system orbits around our Milky Way. When the dinosaurs were living here on this planet, Earth was on the other side of the Milky Way galaxy. We share the same planet, but our cosmic address in the galaxy is very, very different. But I find that instead of trying to comprehend the numerical number of 13.8 billion years, I try to visualize it through hydrogen's journey. Thankfully, you can find online the cosmic calendar. It compresses that 13.8 billion years down to a single year, with the Big Bang happening at midnight on January 1st. When I let my mind reflect on that calendar, the journey those hydrogen atoms took, for a few minutes, I do see things around me differently. This laptop I'm typing on at one point was floating around through space. Dinosaurs stomped over some of the atoms in this microphone I'm talking into right now. Does it feel a little woo-woo? Not so much, because it is a scientific fact using a scientific method tested over and over again to verify that, yes, some of the atoms in this chair I'm sitting on were left here after that huge rock that would go on to be the moon crashed into Earth. I don't mind woo-woo, though. I love the tarot, especially for its storytelling. I did, after all, get a tarot deck for Christmas, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer tarot deck. But what do I get thinking about all of this hydrogen, the cosmos? I find a sense of stillness, even if it's fleeting, in the deluge of news that we're getting on a literally minute-by-minute basis coming from this administration. I'm not thinking of anything facile as "this too shall pass," one of the most horrifically dismissive, even apologist statements of all time. What a way to just completely dismiss all the things that you're feeling and experiencing down to, well, this too shall pass. When I hear folks talk about, we got through the 80s, we'll get through this. Famously, a lot of us didn't get through the 80s. Or we got through, World War II. Well, a lot of us famously didn't get through World War II. No, when I think about all of this hydrogen, I'm reminded that despite the efforts of tens of millions of people in this country and across the globe, this queer body of mine has just as much a right to be here as anyone else. This queer body has been here all along, literally. And that is the end of Lightyear 2. I will continue this series again next week. The next essay, Lightyear 3, we'll be talking about gravity, the most interesting and boring force in the cosmos. I want to say that we have a very interesting episode coming tomorrow. We're going to talk with two authors, Kyle Lukoff and Morgan Morgan, about their new books that they have coming out. Kyle's drops next week, actually, so you're getting a sneak peek of all the reasons why you should be buying this book for all of the kiddos in your life. And for those who enjoy YA Lit and middle grade lit, this one will also be for you. As always, you can connect with us online. We're at Blue Sky at thegaleyshow.org. We do ticket giveaways there. We also, you have chances to be on the show when we're doing interview calls, and you can also get more progressive news and analysis and, just chat with us about what's happening in the world, in your queer world. You can listen to all of our episodes on every podcast platform and find the videos of us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thegaleyshow. In the meantime, have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow at 2 p.m.